Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to talk all about books. I know there are some wonderful resources out there that talk in depth about some of the best books for beginners in historic costuming. This is not an uncommon topic. And a lot of time these lists include things like the Jen and Arnold Patterns of Fashion series or Nora Waugh or Costume in Detail, some of the really great, very popular books that are out there. And those are all wonderful books depending on exactly what you need of them, but they don't cover everything. In fact, they really don't cover all that much. Patterns of Fashion is great if you are looking to understand what sort of shapes were commonly used in what era. But if you don't know a lot about construction, you don't know a lot about textiles, you don't know a lot about what was typically worn with what layers, those things, it doesn't cover any of those things. And you still have to figure out how it fits you. So obviously, it is one part of many things that you need to understand in order to get a grip on this very complex topic. So, what I wanted to do today was take you through some of my personal favorite books, things that I keep finding myself reaching for on the shelf over and over and over again. This is not a comprehensive list. There's no way. I don't have all of the books that I would love to have. I certainly don't have all of the books that are needed for certain specific time periods or types of things. These are just books that I personally really love and think do a great job of covering topics that often get left aside, or cover topics that I get a lot of questions about. But first, I feel like we need a bit of a change of scenery. You see, I'm actually in my library every time I film this with you, but we gotta change the direction just a little bit. 1 second. And yes, this is what's out of frame every time I film, including the sleeping puppy on that side of the sofa. So let's get started with probably my favorite stack that I have, that of the topic of textiles. I know, shocking, right? The first book is Textiles in America, 1650 to 1870, and it's written by Florence M. Montgomery. This book is an absolute treasure if you have any interest in textiles between 1650 and 1870. It goes through the names, the types of textiles they are, and it uses original resources. So it's not just giving modern descriptions, it's actually giving text taken from historical documents of those eras, talking about the different types of textiles, how they're used, what sort of availability that they had, and there's an entire color printed section that shows swatches. So you can actually see what calamanco looked like in the 18th century, or what sort of silk stripes were commonly used for waistcoats in the 1790s. It really is both visually and textually incredibly informative if you have any interest at all when it comes to that era of historic fashion, because understanding what the textiles actually were and what they were used for is really imperative, and this is my favorite resource for that. Of a similar type, we have Wearable Prints 1760 to 1860 by Susan W. Green. This, instead of talking about textile names, goes into the different prints that you find throughout that 100-year period and organizes it by color. So if you want to know what sort of prints were common in turkey red during that era, there's an entire chapter on that, and it goes into details about the different dyes used, the different processes of printing and creating these different textiles. So instead of trying to figure out, well, what sort of floral would they have used in 1820 versus 1850, there's a whole book for that. Again, great general resource if you have any interest in the 18th or 19th centuries when it comes to figuring out what should I even make my clothing out of to begin with. If you're looking for a book on textiles that covers a lot more than just a short window of time in a small region of the world, then 5,000 Years of Textiles is a wonderful resource. It has chapters on everything from lace and French silks to textiles coming out of India and Pakistan, or out of Latin America or Central Asia. It does cover a lot, and frankly what is not a massive book considering the actual topic at hand, but it really digs into how the trade was done in these countries, what types of textiles were made, and some of the different specific designs and prints and garments that were being produced all over the world. So if you want to know more about textiles in general, this is an amazing book for that. And honestly, if you're only going to pick up one book on textiles, this really is the best one to start with because it covers so much and so broadly in a really cohesive way. Getting a little bit more obscure, one of my personal favorites, just because it's fun, is called Elephant's Breath and London Smoke. And it is put together by Deb Salisbury. And this book covers color names. So it's not just for textiles, it would also be wonderful if you're interested in architecture and home decor, and just knowing what interesting names they used for colors centuries ago. It's utterly fascinating. It goes through an alphabetical format, so if you're looking to understand what they called different types of greens historically, it can get a little complicated, but you kind of figure out a good way to go through it is to start off with green, or a green that you know, like emerald, and start looking for dates on those things because not all color names go back centuries. Some of them are 19th or even 20th century inventions. And that gets discussed in there by the fact that you don't see any references for certain colors prior to a certain date. And knowing when they started using those color names and how they described different colors prior to that, especially say in the 19th century as we're inventing all of these new colors with new types of dyes, you have to know when those actually came in, when were they popular. And it's also useful in that format because a lot of the references that are in there are saying, oh yes, in the year 1808, this particular shade of pink was just the absolute most popular thing. So the just breadth of references that are in this little book that just brings me so much joy to go through. And it is honestly something that I recommend just flipping through when you are having a boring day and seeing what interesting names you come across. Because I find it absolutely fascinating to flip through and find out what sort of weird names we used to have for different purples. This next one I know is pretty hard to get a hold of, it's pretty rare, and honestly, it can sometimes be really expensive. I pretty much lucked into getting a secondhand version of this book quite a few years ago, and though I'm not putting it on this list as you must get this book, I do want to put it on this list because I love this book and I want to share some of it with you so you can understand what's actually inside of it and know whether it is eventually worth the investment for you. And that is A Lady of Fashion, Barbara Johnson's Albums of Styles and Fabrics. This is essentially scanned in full color pages from a sort of diary of sorts that was kept by a woman in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And this was all of the different things that she purchased and had made. So she has swatches of fabric next to fashion plates and descriptions of what she purchased, how much it cost, what she calls that exact textile and color. So if you are interested in the very late 18th century, early 19th century, oh, there's so much wonderful information that is really hard to find in one place. You can find descriptions of textiles, you can find swatches of textiles, you can find fashion plates, but to have someone put them all together and talk about what they personally wore, what they personally did, is a magical experience. So if you are ever able to come across this book secondhand and it's at an affordable price, jump on that one. It is such a beautiful, beautiful book. For the next section, I wanted to get into the technical aspects of historic sewing. Now this is where we typically get those beginner books like Patterns of Fashion or Costume and Detail, but these are some of the books that I really love and find myself going back to over and over again, and I don't hear mentioned quite as often. You might know about some of these, but perhaps some of them are new to you. So we're going to start at the very furthest back that I have, and that is the Tudor Tailor series by Nina Michaela and Jane Malcolm Davies. Now, if you do anything anywhere around the Tudor era, this is a series of books you have to have. It is such a great resource. They talk in different books about the construction techniques and the general patterns and what sort of garments would have been worn by what type of people, how things were layered up and worn and used, because that is their experience. They've been making these clothing items for years at this point, not just to look pretty, but for use by people. They have them being put on interpreters, and so they actually get to see how these clothes move, wear, and function compared to the actual historic pieces that they do have access to. So Jane and Nina are absolutely astounding when it comes to a resource for anything near the 16th century. I reference these books when I'm doing the 15th century and the 17th century because it kind of gives you a general idea of how things are moving throughout that era, how things are changing, because it gives you descriptions, like I said, of the construction, the shapes, the fabrics, and all of the other details that you need to know in order to understand that era better. Moving forward, we have 17th century women's dress patterns, and this is 2 different books in the series, and this was put together by Susan North and Jenny Tiramani, and this is the example to me of what I want every single technical book to be. These 2 books just have everything I could ever want in them for that particular era, and I would just love if it just kept expanding into all of the different time periods. I know that you have a very similar adjustment being made to the Patterns of Fashion series and the new versions that they're putting out, but just, oh, these books, because they not only have pictures and x-rays and great up-close detail shots of the original garments that they are using and pulling patterns and diagrams off of, but they actually took the time to go through and figure out about how they were put together. They essentially have instructions, step-by-step instructions in these books for exactly how this particular doublet or jacket or gown was put together. So if you do anything in the 17th century, or again, just sort of on the edge of either side of it, these books are just absolute necessities. Do I do much in the 17th century? No. But do I pull these books out a lot? Yeah. It's a really weird thing. I swear, I pull them out more than I actually do sewing from that century. That's how good they are. The next book is very near and dear to my heart. This book is Costume Close-Up, and it covers 1750 to 1790. Again, like all of the other books that have a sort of time range to them, this can give you information a couple of decades outside of that as well. Costume Close-Up is actually very special to me because it was the very first historical fashion book I ever purchased. So this is really where I started, and it was published through Colonial Williamsburg, so it's using the collection that they have there. And it's particularly great if you are looking for menswear of the 18th century information because it actually has both men's and women's wear in it, which is a rare thing in a lot of historical fashion books. So it covers both of those topic areas, and essentially they sort of dig into different garments in their collection. They give you those basic shapes that are taken from those garments so you can see how sleeves were cut. They also go into detail on the layers that are internal. So if you've ever wondered how does the structure work inside of a man's 18th century frock coat, it's in there. How do you deal with the different layers of structure inside of a women's pair of 18th century stays? It's in there. And so this resource is really a great beginner's look, which honestly, I think if you're looking at 18th century stuff, this book is better to pick up than the Janet Arnold series because this goes into a little bit more detail than that book does when it comes to this specific era. But it has a very similar feel to it. It just has a little bit more information. And again, this is where I started. I made my first pair of stays, petticoat, jacket, cap, apron, everything. Oh, mitts, pockets, everything. My first entire set of 18th century clothing came directly out of this book. Next we have The Lady's Stratagem, which was edited and translated and put together with some additional information by Frances Grimble. And this book goes into a lot of detail that you would need to know to function in a household of the 1820s. So if you're looking for sewing information, around 1820s era, this is the book for you. It not only talks about how to sew basic household things that you would expect, like caps and kerchiefs and aprons and different things like that. It also talks a little bit about gown making and some of those details. It also goes into a great detail about how to wash and care for your clothes, or about how to just function in daily life. So it's more than just a sewing book, but it gives a lot of great detail that I know I have gone back to quite often when I'm doing 1830s or anything in that realm, and I know a lot of other people who also constantly reference this book. It comes up pretty often in any discussion about how to make clothing from around 1810 through to 1840, just because, again, though it's based in the 1820s, these aren't things that are changing incredibly rapidly. How you stitch a basic corset, how you stitch a basic cap, really similar concepts. So this is a great place if you are looking for construction techniques of that era. Next up, I am jumping pretty far forward to get to Vintage Couture Tailoring by Thomas von Nordheim. This one for me was just the perfect resource to pull together all of this different information that I was hearing in different places and finding pictures of tailored garments inside and out, finding documentation from the 19th and early 20th centuries that give little tidbits of how to put this together or that together, little information, little advice, and it's just sometimes hard to visualize how all of it's actually supposed to go together. And this book does a great job of talking about vintage tailoring and how you go through essentially step by step to do different types of pockets, different types of interfacing, why you use interfacing here or there. It just has a really great overview that helped clarify a lot for me because it is very, very clearly written. This is especially great in the fact that though there are a lot of resources for tailoring manuals and drafting books in the 19th and very early 20th centuries, once you hit the 1920s, then we start getting into issues of copyright. So there are fewer and fewer available resources online for that era. And this covers that section that sort of bridges the gap between 19th century Victorian tailoring and modern tailoring. It has really helped me reading those 19th century tailoring manuals and understanding what they are actually talking about, because they're not always the best with words or descriptions. They certainly don't put a lot of pictures in. And this book, I found more so than any of the other tailoring books that I have picked up, really helped clearly lay out what I am looking at, what I am reading about. Now, shockingly enough, I don't have a wide variety of books on shoes and shoe history, in part because a lot of the books that are out there are what we tend to call coffee table books, meaning that they are visually beautiful. They have a lot of wonderful images of shoes. They don't really give you that much information. And honestly, I have a lot of shelves of those types of costuming books too, like Fashion from the Kyoto Museum, that show you beautiful things, but they're not really going to give you a ton of textual information alongside of it. There is one exception that I have found in the book world for shoes that's not completely pictures or completely going deep into textual dives of shoe history, and that is Women's Shoes in America, which covers 1795 to 1930. And this is from Nancy E. Rexford. This book I particularly love because it covers a fairly wide range of time when it comes to what we consider modern shoe manufacturing, which really does go back to the 18th century, if not slightly before. And this book talks not just about what shoes looked like, but also how they were constructed, what they were actually made out of, how the actual production process worked in the sense of how was manufacturing done, where was manufacturing done, what sort of setup did these shops have, and what sort of trade systems. So it goes into far more than just there were square toes around this era and there were some heels here too. It actually gets into some better and bigger information than just visually looking at a bunch of beautiful pictures of shoes. The next section I want to talk about is slightly more of the academic nature. Things that will take you far above and beyond simply looking at clothing of the era and understanding how it was worn, understanding the ideal shapes and figures that people were going for, understanding what sort of clothing was worn by different people in different societies and different classes. So these books cover a broader, bigger picture, which I think is really essential to how we understand fashion history today. The first one that I wanted to mention is The Dress of the People by John Styles. Again, if you have any interest in the 18th or early 19th centuries, this is a book for you. This talks about what was actually typically worn by different people in different classes. So this is not just the highest and grandest of the most expensive fashion, but we're actually going to understand how clothing was interacted with, how clothing was treated, worn, repaired, and just lived in. This book does particularly center on 18th century English fashion, but the research that is in there gives you a great outline of how that sort of research can be done for lots of different countries, lots of different time periods. While I certainly don't have examples for every single time period in every single region of the world, this is a perfect example of how to go about that sort of research. And he does a great job of showing you how to actually dig into resources that you wouldn't otherwise know exist or would be great resources for understanding historical fashion. So even if this isn't your time period or your location that you're interested in, it can be a great map to understand how to go about this for different places and different eras. I get a similar feel from American Beauty by Lois Banner, and this covers the 19th and 20th centuries in America, and it talks about the ideal of women's beauty through those two different centuries, which the idea of what is beautiful changes absolutely dramatically during that time. If you have any interest in understanding what idealized beauty is, how we ended up with these concepts, why was it that the frail look in the 1830s was so in versus the more curvy, buxom look in the 1860s, or the strong and athletic woman in the 1900s, how did we get to these different ideals? And to see it change so much over those eras and actually understand why it did and how it did, and this is just such a great book if you have any interest in the idea of the silhouette. What was the goal of the clothing? What were people trying to get to? Understanding that aspect from a historical costuming aspect is great, and then from a personal aspect, dismantling your entire concept of what is beauty, what is ideal, what should we look like, what do I wish I looked like, all of that just absolutely gets torn apart with this. And in the best way, it really does. So again, one of my favorite books, if you couldn't tell. Branching off from there, we have The Fashioned Body by Joanne Entwistle. Now, this is the book if you want to start understanding our relationship with clothing on more than just a historical level. That certainly is in there, but it talks about clothing as communication, clothing as expression, and really helps you understand what relationship we as people have with clothing and fashion, why it is so incredibly important, not only on an academic level, but on a personal level, on a societal level, all of those things. So if you've ever struggled to try and explain to someone why what we do within historical fashion is actually important, why clothing is actually important, this is the book. Read this book, and the just way that you look at our relationship with fashion will just be filled out with so much wonderful description of how we as people just constantly use it without even realizing it. Last but certainly not least is women's work, The First 20,000 Years by Elizabeth Wayland Barber. And if you have not come across this glorious book before, go get it. Just go. It helping to understand how we ended up with textiles, with sewn clothes, with the concept that sewing is women's work, that clothing is women's interest. How did we get there? How did we develop this idea? And there's so much more in there. And everyone that I know that has read this book who does historical fashion has just raved about how it changed their perspective on things and how it helped them articulate our relationship with clothing and textiles on a new level. So this is one of those books where even if you really are just interested in making things and interested in wearing really beautiful garments, I still recommend this book because it really helps you from a historical background change your mindset of how you and the world around you interact with your clothing. Clothing was an essential part of human history, and it was not seen as frivolous until very recently. And it was also not seen as a feminine-only thing until recently. And understanding its background can just... This goes beyond just historical fashion. This really helps you have a better relationship with your own everyday closet. So that is the list of some of my personal favorite books. I have so many others. I'm going to put links down below to other ones that I particularly love but just couldn't quite get into this video. And I would also love it if there's a book or books that you particularly love and really recommend to people, especially if it is on a very niche topic or time period or location. Those are the best. Put them in the comments below. I want to know what else I should be looking for, what else should be on my favorites list, on my bookshelf that is always ever growing. Because even though we turn to more and more of a digital world, I do most of my specific research in digital format, I always come back to these books over and over and over again, because sometimes they articulate the words that I cannot. Sometimes they have images in them that inspire me. Sometimes it's just better to have a physical example of a layout of a garment in front of you rather than trying to understand it from a digital screen. These things provide so much more than we can get in just digital format with research and trying to find bits of information here and there and pick out from different places. These take together so much information and put it into one central place that can really help you understand and translate all of the things that you are going to find in your own personal research. So these are some of the books that I find myself going back to all the time, and I would love to hear from you. What are some of your favorites? Don't eat my books again. You've already done that too many times.